Hello students, and welcome to another video. I'm your teacher, Mr. Flynn, and today we're going to be focusing on the different classifications of different types of transport. And the two main categories that we break them into is called passive transport and active transport. And when we break these apart, what we're looking for is, does it require energy or does it not require energy? So in passive transport, it does not require energy for substances to move across a membrane. Okay, in this image, there's three main types. We call them diffusion, and then we also, or actually, facilitated diffusion. Now, facilitated diffusion has different modes of transport, like through a cell membrane with these transport proteins. But overall, I'm not going to get into like the different types of how substances move in. All I want you to know is that if it's moving across the membrane without any help, it literally just crosses over without any assistance. We just call that simple, plain diffusion. Now, facilitated diffusion says that you need to have something to guide it, and that's what these transport proteins are showing here, is that it's requiring some help. It's too big. Like, for example, glucose is much too big to enter cells, and that's why we need insulin to open up the gateway channels to allow sugar to enter our cells, okay? Because it's dangerous to let sugar run through your bloodstream, okay? If your cells aren't good at uptaking sugar from your bloodstream, these really large, complex molecules, then it leads to something called diabetes, all right? So facilitated diffusion requires, it's usually multi-stepped, like it has signaling, those kind of things, but it requires some way of transporting them into the cell, okay? That's facilitated, and that's passive transport. Then we have water moving through, and that actually doesn't require any energy, and that's just called osmosis. So passive transport all moves from an area of high concentration to low concentration. All right, the particles are moving, okay, from high to low. Except for in the case of osmosis. Osmosis is the opposite, okay? But in general senses, like the osmosis is really just being added on here to show you that water is still moving. All right, there's a dynamicness here, but when it comes to transporting like things other than water, all right, these triangles, these circles, okay, they move from an area of high to low concentration, okay? Osmosis is kind of the opposite, where it moves in the other direction because it's doing the opposite of where the particles are. Like if there's more particles outside, out here, water is going to flow that way to just push them away. So there actually is a dynamicness that's happening. It's not just one direction, okay? When particles are going from high to low, water is going from low to high. So they're working with each other. So just recognize that difference. But in general, when we're looking with particles, we're looking at transporting particles, they move from high to low. Okay? The other part is active transport, which it requires energy to move them across the membrane. Okay? And they move from areas of low concentration to high concentration. An example of this is what we'll learn in the next unit on cellular energy and how we have to pump particles across the membrane to create a gradient. So what's happening is, in certain situations, the cell has to create energy or to do a function. It has to work against the grain. It can't just go with the flow, because over here, passive transport, it's going with the flow. It's going from high to low concentration. It just goes and moves where it needs to. But here, in certain situations, we need to create situations where we have a difference of high and low, and typically you're pumping from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. And it requires energy to pump them across that membrane and to push them over to create that gradient for it to exist. Because we can't just let everything come and go and flow. We actually have to push against the gradient sometimes. And when we push against the gradient, it requires energy. And energy, which we'll learn about later, is called ATP. And ATP is going to power this mechanism to push things from an area of low to high concentration. Okay? So just recognize passive and active are opposites of each other. And you have to recognize passive transport, high to low. Active transport, low to high. One requires energy, and that is active transport. One does not require energy, and that is called passive transport. Okay? And just recognize water is the opposite. It's just going to be freely flowing, but it's going to move wherever the particles are going. It's going to spread them out, just like we learned with isotonic, hypertonic, and hypotonic solutions. Okay? The last part here is exocytosis and endocytosis. Okay? You can think of exo meaning exit, endo, meaning enter, okay? And what we're doing is cytosis, so we're, from the cell, we're removing those substances. So exiting the cell, basically, that's what that word means. And so these particles are in a vesicle, and they're being deposited to the surroundings. And the endocytosis, the membrane, forms a vesicle around our particle that we want to pull into the cell. And both of these require energy, and they are a form of active transport. Okay? So just recognize active transport represents exo and endocytosis, and it moves from an area of low to high concentration. And it requires energy and a transport protein. Passive transport, things move passively, they don't require energy, and it goes from an area of high to low concentration. And it can be facilitated, or it can just be plain diffusion. Osmosis is the opposite, and it will flow to wherever those particles are and the concentrations, and it will work with that. So there is a dynamicness there. Okay? If you have questions, please come talk with me, or read through the textbook and try to see if you can piece it together. And I will help work with you to help build this understanding. Okay? All right, thanks again for watching. Until next time.